right, so chapter 6. Okay. So what are we going to focus on here? Okay. There are lots of different models for pattern formation, but we're thinking about, at the moment, PDE models. And in particular here, we're going to focus on reaction-diffusion models, and we're going to focus on models that generate patterns through what is called a diffusion-driven instability. Okay. So we're going to focus on reaction-diffusion models and a mechanism for generating patterns known as a diffusion driven instability. And you might also come across it in terms of, or under the name of the Turing instability. So this was a mechanism put forward by Alan Turing. And so what do we want to be able to do as a summary of this chapter? Well, we're going to write down quite a general sort of model for patterning, or general reaction diffusion model, and we're going to ask the question, how do we analyse that model, okay, in order to determine if we can get spatial patterns to form in the model. And then we're going to ask questions about how well we can predict what the patterns might look like. Okay, so there are two key questions that we want to answer. And we're going to start off with doing everything in quite a generic way, because it's sort of simpler to do it that way, I think. And then we are going to look at a particular example. And I'll try and remember to say this again at the end. But if you have a device that you can bring along tomorrow, laptop or an iPad, that might be really useful, because we'll look at generating some patterns live in the lecture. Okay. All right, so what are the system of equations? So we're going to work with a two-species model. So I think I called it 6.1 in my notes. So diffusion-driven instability. So we've got a two-species model. We're going to try and fit it up here. Okay, so we've got du dt is equal to, so our system, we've got diffusion of our species u with diffusion coefficient du, and then we've got some reaction kinetics. So u can react with another species v according to some reaction term f. And then we have a very similar equation for v, where v can also diffuse in our domain, and it can react with u according to some reaction kinetics g. Okay. So we're going to mostly stick to 1 and 2D Cartesian coordinates, but we're going to do everything in generality for now. So x, our spatial point system, some bounded domain omega, and t is going to lie between 0 and infinity. Okay. We are going to have initial conditions, which we'll leave fairly general for now. What do I say? That u of x and 0 is just some u0 of x, and v of x0 is just some v0 of x. And we would like some boundary conditions as well. So typically one of two things in this course. You can choose you can choose other things if you like. So we're often either going to consider Dirichlet boundary conditions. So U just takes some value UB, V takes some value VB for X on the boundary. Or we might want homogeneous Neumann, so n dot grad U equals 0, n dot grad V equals 0 for X on the boundary. Okay, so n outward pointing unit normal. Actually, one of the things that I want you to try to think about as a result of kind of the lecture notes and also the questions on the problem sheets is what happens in terms of my patterns when I switch from Dirichlet to Neumann boundary conditions. Okay, so if I'm considering exactly the same problem otherwise, so the same set of equations, same F and G, same du, dv, same initial conditions, what might I expect to be different as a result of changing my boundary conditions, and why might that be? Okay. All right, so what am I interested in? I'm interested in patterns. So patterns for us are going to be stable, time-independent, spatially varying or spatially heterogeneous solutions of this system of equations with one of these sets of boundary conditions, okay? And I want to think about patterning via a diffusion-driven instability. So just as a definition, there aren't too many in this course, but this is one of them. So a diffusion-driven instability occurs when a spatially uniform steady state that is stable in the absence of diffusion becomes unstable when diffusion is present. Okay, so there's our definition. Okay, so what's this saying? It is saying if I knock out diffusion in these terms, I can think about having a steady state that's governed in exactly the way we've looked at this as before, as solutions of f of u and v is 0 and g of u and v is 0. Okay? And what I want is if I don't have any diffusion present for my spatially uniform steady state, so no spatial gradients or heterogeneities, I want the system to just happily sit there and be stable to small perturbations. Okay, that's what's going to happen. And then when I add diffusion back in, that spatially uniform steady state is going to become unstable, which means that if I make small spatially heterogeneous perturbations into the system, okay, they are going to grow over time, and that's what's going to seed a pattern. Okay. Why is this something that maybe is counterintuitive? Probably because we've spent a lot of time, both in first year and in parts of this course maybe, talking about the fact that diffusion is something that tends to kind of even out spatial gradients, right? That's what it does, right? And so it sort of seems counterintuitive that adding in diffusion drives a steady state to become unstable and effectively enables the generation of a spatial pattern. And essentially, spatial heterogeneities means we've got gradients. Okay, so in some senses, it's kind of a surprising point, because diffusion on its own essentially is just driving dispersal, everything towards equilibrium. But when we combine the diffusion with the reactions, we can get patterns. Okay. We can talk about this more at some point, but one important thing to note is that there's absolutely really conclusive evidence that that these kinds of mechanisms can be realized in chemical systems, right? We can find these diffusion-driven instabilities in the lab, and there's sort of mounting evidence that they also play a role in driving the generation of patterns in nature. So various examples like patterning on animal skin. Okay, so let's try and work out, or let's try to understand whether this is possible or not in this system, and the conditions that we might need on the diffusion coefficients and on our F and G to see a diffusion-driven instability. So we're going to only really start this today, maybe lay out the framework, and we will sort of finish the linear analysis tomorrow. Okay, so what do I call it? 6.1.1 linear analysis. Okay, so let's just write this in matrix form and put a bit of a firmer footing on it. So I've got d by dt of uv. That's going to be equal to, so if I write it in matrix form, a diagonal matrix with the diffusion coefficients in it times the Laplacian of u and v plus the reaction terms f of u and v and g of u and v. Okay, and we will take, so again, x in some bounded domain omega, t being greater than 0. And let's put some Neumann boundary conditions on this. So we've got n dot grad u is equal to 0, n dot grad v is equal to 0, and the outward pointing unit normal, and x on the boundary. Okay. So if I let this thing be the vector u, I can let this thing be the matrix of diffusion coefficients, and I might often call this f of u, like that as well. So that it just becomes a bit simpler to write this as du by dt is equal to d times the Laplacian of u plus f of u, with x in omega t in 0t, infinity, and n dot grad u equal to 0. And I need to obviously specify some initial conditions here, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but for now we can just assume these generic initial conditions that we had before. Okay, so this is the system that we are working with. When we do linear analysis, then the key thing that we normally do is to say, well, what happens if I start at a steady state and then I make a small perturbation to it? And in particular, I want to think about, if I go back to, I've just put it up at the top of the board here, I'm thinking about this spatially uniform steady state, and I want it to be stable without diffusion. So I've got a spatially uniform steady state. Okay, so I'm going to call it vector us, and so this is just going to be f of u is given by f of us is equal to 0. So just otherwise in the language we've been using, this would have just been a US that was vector US VS, and it satisfies f of US, VS is 0, and G of US, VS is equal to 0. So if you're happier writing it that way, then just by all means, do it that way. So we want to make a perturbation, a small perturbation to this steady state. So let our vector u be equal to the spatially uniform steady state plus some perturbation w, where w is something that we always just want to be small. So it's a small perturbation. In here. And then the usual plan of attack, let's substitute into our reaction diffusion equation. So if we do that on the left-hand side, we're going to get what? So we're just going to get dw by dt on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we've got d times the Laplacian of w here, noting Laplacian of u is 0, it's spatially uniform. And then we've got to think about what to do with f. So if you think about that, what I want to do is effectively Taylor expand with f. So the first term that comes out is just going to be f evaluated at the steady state. Okay, and then the second term that comes out is going to be the sort of the first order term in my Taylor series expansion, and I'm going to write that as JW. I've got higher order terms. And this matrix J, yeah. So you can think about this if you're slightly worried, just go home and do this, substituting the different perturbations. What you end up with is all the partial derivatives of f and g. So it's this Jacobian matrix of partial derivatives, and it's that evaluated at the steady state. Okay, so this really drops out of just Taylor expanding f of u in steady state. Okay. Okay, and then just not forgetting our boundary condition, which I think I've just dropped off the top of the board. Oh no, it's over there. So my boundary condition is just going to be n dotted with grad w is equal to 0 for x on the boundary, and this is for omega. And then the key point here, and I haven't written it out, is that if we're doing a linear analysis, we're going to neglect these terms, right? So neglect, because it's linear. So the effective equation we're working with is this one in here. And the other thing to remember, right, is that this is 0 because that's the definition of my spatially uniform steady state. So actually, what I wind up with is I should just have dw by dt is equal to d times the Laplacian of w plus jw, where j is this thing here. Make it a bit more clear. So matrix for x in omega and for n dot grad w to be equal to 0 for x in d omega. Okay. So this is essentially the equation that's going to we're going to analyse to get all our conditions out. I think we'll stop there because we're basically out of time. But what we're going to do tomorrow, first thing, is we're effectively going to think, okay, this is the linear equation. I can write down, or sort of begin to write down a form for these solutions, and then as I proceed to analyse this equation, try and derive essentially a set of conditions on these various partial derivatives and on the diffusion coefficients that gives me this spatially uniform steady state being stable when I don't have diffusion, and then I will ask questions about how I can drive it unstable when I put diffusion back in. Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, guys. I will see you tomorrow.